These restaurants were once giant nationwide chains and regional powerhouses, but today they'll all just vanished. Want to know what happened to them? Join us today as we look at 20 forgotten chain restaurants that are no longer around. 1. Chi-Chi's.
What's in Chi-Chi's new Sonoran sampler? A grande burro and...
Chi-Chi's had a pretty interesting story. It was founded by experienced restaurateur Marno McDermott, named after his nickname for his wife, in partnership with Green Bay Packers legend Max McGee. The first Chi-Chi's opened in Richfield, Minnesota in August 1976. The restaurant was in good hands from the start. McDermott knew more than a bit about restaurants, having founded the Zapata fast food Mexican chain, which later became Zantigo. From shortly after its launch to 1986, the chain was run by former KFC executive Shelley Frank, who moved the chain's headquarters to his hometown of Louisville. The biggest draw of the restaurant chain was the warm atmosphere and the hearty Tex-Mex staples it served. You weren't going to find a masterpiece at Chi-Chi's, but it pretty much had something for everyone. It was a family favorite, especially in the Midwest, but that sadly wouldn't last long. Things were looking right up till the mid-90s. By March 1995, the restaurant chain had expanded to its peak of 210 locations. Things came crashing down right after. The company grew too big too fast, and that many chains proved too much to manage. The quality of service nosedived, and naturally, customer patronage followed. By October 2003, the company would find itself filing for bankruptcy. But that was far from the end of the restaurant chain's problems. Just a month later, Chi-Chi's was hit with the largest hepatitis A outbreak in American history, which 660 people would fall victim to, and at least 4 people would die by. After the hepatitis outbreak was traced back to green onions at a Chi-Chi's near Monica, Pennsylvania, Chi-Chi's would face a string of lawsuits that would lead the chain to close more than half of its locations. That same year, Outback Steakhouse bid upwards of $42 million for the rights to buy part of Chi-Chi's 76 properties, and just a month later, Chi-Chi closed the rest of its remaining restaurants. Our next restaurant wouldn't fare much better. 2. Beefsteak Charlie.
With shrimp at Beefsteak Charlie's tonight.
Beefsteak Charlie's started out in the early 20th century as an uptown Manhattan restaurant for sports enthusiasts. Beefsteak Charlie's was named after sports editor Howard Williams' nickname for its founder, Charles W. Chesser. Chesser opened the first Beefsteak Charlie's in 1910, and despite a few location changes, he would continue to operate it until 1934. This restaurant was originally filled with horse racing photography, most of which would sadly be destroyed by a fire in March 1933. The Beefsteak Charlie's restaurant chain we all know and love has little to do with the Manhattan restaurant beyond the name, though. Many decades later, in early 1976, seasoned restaurateur Larry Ellman opted to rename his steak and brew fast food chain to Beefsteak Charlie's Inc. and converted many of its locations into Beefsteak Charlie's. Beefsteak Charlie's was beloved for its rich menu and quality food options, and of course, the genius marketing. If you grew up going to the restaurant, you probably still remember its 2 most famous slogans, "I'll feed you like there's no tomorrow," and "You're gonna get spoiled." They also emphasized their all-you-can-eat salad bar, unlimited beer, wine, and sangria. By 1984, the rapidly growing chain had over 60 locations, most of them on the East Coast. After a name change of its parent company the following year, Beefsteak Charlie's was acquired by Bombay Palace Restaurants in August 1987. At the time of the merger, the chain was already struggling, having lost over 20 locations and $20 million since 1984. By the time Bombay would file for bankruptcy in 1987, though, the chain would be left with only 35 outlets. This next restaurant chain was one of the biggest successes of its time, but it would fail just as hard. 3. Burger Chef.
Burger Chef, you're incredible!
After Frank and Donald Thomas patented the flame broiler in 1954, they went on to open their first restaurant in Indianapolis, Indiana. 3 years later, They would open their first Burger Chef. Burger Chef quickly grew into a juggernaut across the United States, rapidly expanding into well over 1,000 locations from coast to coast. The secret to the franchise's success was focusing on opening outlets in smaller towns. After a decade of success, General Foods Corporation bought the chain in 1968, and things only got better from there. By that time, Burger Chef already had well over 600 locations in 39 states. A year later, Burger Chef expanded overseas and built 10 new outlets in Australians, an endeavor which would sadly prove unsuccessful and lose the company over $1 million. By 1972, the company reached a historic peak of 1,200 locations, making it the second largest chain in the United States. Taking advantage of the momentum, the chain launched the Fun Burger and the Fun Meal, both treats targeted towards kids, complete with toys, cookies, and puzzles. These new treats were so successful that by the time McDonald's introduced the Happy Meal in 1979, the chain sued, but ultimately lost. Not stopping there, they also introduced the Big Chef, Super Chef, and the Works Bar. After a dip in sales and a management that couldn't manage the restaurant chain's massive size, General Foods sold Burger Chef to Imasco for $44 million. Imasco converted most of its locations to Hardee's restaurants and left the ones that didn't convert to Hardee's or other restaurants to close. Our next restaurant chain would meet a similar fate. 4 All-Star Cafe. The official All-Star Cafe was where sports met quality food. This brand, created by Planet Hollywood, was focused right from the jump on sports, so much so that Planet Hollywood recruited some of Hollywood's biggest stars, sports and otherwise, to invest in the brand. The restaurant was incredibly sports-themed, with the restaurant selling stadium cuisine and professional sports merchandise and souvenirs. The first All-Star Cafe opened in December 1995 at the Times Square, followed by 2 more in Cancun, and the Showcase Mall in Las Vegas the following year. From day one, All-Star was far more focused on sports novelty and merchandise than quality food service. While the food was pretty good, it wasn't good enough to hold up on its own. So, by the time the trend of themed restaurants wore off, leading to a dip in sales for All-Star Cafe, and a major reshuffling of Planet Hollywood by December 1998, Planet Hollywood put All-Star Cafe up for sale. Up till 2001, official All-Star Cafe locations also were operated alongside Planet Movies by AMC Entertainment complexes at a couple of locations in the U.S. Things continued to grind slowly to a halt for All-Star Cafe with Planet Hollywood's bankruptcy filing on October the 11th, 1999. By that time, only 9 locations were left across the country. Disney buying the company couldn't save it, and by September 2007, the last official All-Star Cafe would close for good. Our next restaurant wouldn't fare much better, sadly. 5 Kenny Rogers Roasters.
You're gonna love this food.
Kenny Rogers Roaster.
Holiday parties, use Kenny Rogers Roasters catering service.
Themed restaurants, especially celebrity-themed restaurants, were a big trend in the 80s and 90s, and Kenny Rogers Roasters would prove to be one of the most successful of all of them. Kenny Rogers Roasters was founded in 1991 by country music legend Kenny Rogers and former KFC exec and former Governor John Y. Brown Jr. After working with the KFC and Lums, and then serving as governor of Kentucky from 1979 to 1983, John Y. Brown Jr. decided to return to running restaurants. Kenny Rogers had just released his cookbook, so it was the perfect time to open a restaurant in his name. Kenny Rogers Roasters was one of several restaurants to open in Florida in 1991, as a lot of people were trying to capitalize on the popularity of grilled chicken at the time. By 1995, the chain grew to over 350 locations, most of them being in Canada, Europe, the Middle East. The menu also followed suit, expanding to include turkey, ribs, and a variety of side dishes. The growth of Kenny Rogers would be put to the test with the fierce competition it would face from Boston Chicken and other regional roasted chicken chains in coming years. Noticing Kenny Rogers' success, KFC introduced Rotisserie Gold, a roasted chicken line of products to further corner the market. The troubles wouldn't end there. In 1992, a smaller roasted chicken food chain sued Kenny Rogers, claiming the chain had copied its recipes and menus. The lawsuit continued for 2 more years until Cluckers bought up a majority stake in Cluckers. After a decline in sales and competition from bigger brands, Kenny Rogers filed for bankruptcy in March 1998 and was bought by 1970's, Inc. And as a result of restructuring, the chain's new management would close most of its locations the following year. By 2000, the chain was down to just 90 franchised restaurants. In 2008, 1970's, Inc. sold Kenny Rogers Roasters to their Asian franchisee, Roasters Asia Pacific Limited. The last Kenny Rogers Roasters operating in North America closed on December 31, 2011. 6. Burger Queen.
Let me give you a little friendly advice. The next time you want the best fish around, go fish at Burger Queen.
Burger Queen started out in 1956 as a restaurant opened by Harold and Helen Kite. Things took off in 1961 when business partners George Clark and Jim Gannon bought franchise rights to Burger Queen and the rights to expand the chain. Eventually, they bought the restaurant chain, and George Clark became the CEO of the company. The company enjoyed a lot of success from the 60s to the 70s, and by 1973, Burger Queen had already opened 50 locations across the United States. By the late 70s, it opened over 125. Burger Queen was the place to go back then if you were looking for quality fast food. They had a solid hamburger menu and a variety of sides to go with it. On the marketing end, everyone knew Burger Queen for their iconic mascot, a giant female bee named Queenie Bee. In 1981, the company would decide to do the unexpected and undergo a whole branding makeover, changing its name from Burger Queen Restaurants. The main reason given for the name change was that Burger Chain wanted to evolve beyond its reputation as a burger chain and put more of a spotlight on its other offerings, like its fried chicken and a serve-yourself salad bar. The menu and management, however, remained the same. As at the time of this name change, Druthers owned over 171 locations within the U.S. alone and a host of international franchises across the world. After a gradual decline in sales through the decade, Druthers Inc. agreed to become a territory operator for Dairy Queen and converted most of its restaurants to the Dairy Queen outlet by early 1991. By 1996, Dairy Queen bought a few of those outlets from Druthers Inc. These days, nearly all the former Druthers locations now house other businesses. The last Druthers left operating in the U.S. is in Campbellsville, Kentucky. 7. Po Folks.
For the best value in town, it all adds up. Po Folks, hearty home-style cooking.
Po Folks started out as a family restaurant that opened up in Anderson, South Carolina in 1975. The restaurant was named after the 1961 hit single by country music singer Bill Anderson. Although he planned to sue the restaurant chain at first, he eventually decided to sell the rights to the chain and serve as its spokesperson. He, and another music legend, Conway Twitty, eventually got the rights to one of the franchise's locations in Oklahoma City in 1983. The restaurant chain would even later sponsor his country-themed game show. The restaurant would continue to expand and would get an even bigger boost in 1982, when the chain would eventually be acquired by the fast food chain Crystal. By 1984, Po Folks had 102 restaurants in 17 states. A big part of the restaurant's success was its solid menu offerings and wide variety of main dishes and sides to gorge on. The quality customer service guaranteed that eating there would always be a good time. But on the back end, management issues would foreshadow the restaurant chain's end. Po Folks' reputation would first take a hit when Eric Holm, the chain's director of construction, was accused of taking bribes for favorable construction deals. Shortly after this, Crystal merged Po Folks with Davco, the division of the company that managed the Wendy's franchises. But sadly, that wouldn't be enough, and by 1988, Po Folks filed for bankruptcy. All Po Folks restaurants were sold, and the remaining assets continued to operate as Davco. Nowadays, there are a few Po Folks locations operating in Florida, but the restaurant chain is essentially a thing of the past. Our next restaurant chain would end up a victim of its success. 8 Wetsons. Wetson's was a fast food hamburger chain founded by Herbert Wettinson. He got the inspiration to open the restaurant while he was on a road trip to San Bernardino, California. While he was there, he happened to stop by the original McDonald's hamburger drive-in restaurant. The son of a restaurateur himself, Herb was inspired by this style of running restaurants, one that was new and unique at the time. Right after coming back from the military, Wettinson began looking for a suitable location for his brainchild. He would eventually buy a closed Mayflower coffee and donut shop in that town, and alongside his younger brother, Errol Wettinson, Herbert would open the first Wetsons in their name in 1959. The chain experienced great success and started to expand rapidly across the state of New York, becoming a regional powerhouse. Wetson's was famous for its signature burger, the Big W, and its very cheap food. How cheap? Well, they sold 15-cent burgers and 10-cent fries. They were also pretty famous for their iconic slogans, "Look for the orange circles" and "Buy a bag full," phrases that were inspired by the McDonald's slogan, "Look for the golden arches," and White Castle's "Buy 'em by the sack." Their signature Big W sandwich was very similar to the McDonald's Big Mac we know today. Another major selling point of Wetson's was its breakfast sandwiches. Wetson's would start to fall on hard times when national hamburger chains McDonald's and Burger King broke the New York metropolitan area market in the late 60s and early 70s. The fast-rising restaurant chain struggled to compete, leading it to merge with Nathan's famous fast food chain in 1975. What followed was the closing of 29 Wetson's locations and the ultimate closing of the Wetson's brand. This next restaurant was a far bigger hit, but it vanished just as quickly. 9 Arthur Treacher's.
Put an Arthur Treacher smile on your face. Put an Arthur Treacher smile on your face.
Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips was a seafood-focused seafood restaurant chain that was a big hit in the 60s and 70s. The chain was the namesake of iconic English actor Arthur Treacher, partially chosen as the face of the restaurant because he was typecast as the perfect butler. In its early days, Arthur Treacher served as a spokesperson for the restaurant chain to give the chain some British character. In a 1975 interview, the New England franchise vice president M. John Elliott claimed the restaurant chain's recipe belonged to the actor, but that was never proved or disproved. The parent company of Arthur Treacher's first started in Columbus, Ohio, in 1969 as National Fast Food Corp. At its head at the time were S. Robert Davis, a real estate developer, restaurateur, and future Wendy's founder Dave Thomas, and L.S. Hartzog. Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips specialized in British cuisine and brought a spin to it that made it a hit with the American audience. Suddenly, people in the U.S. couldn't get enough of fish and chips and other classic British treats. The menu offerings were hearty and wholesome, and its heyday, Arthur Treacher's, was the perfect place for families to go to for a good time. At its peak in the mid-70s, Arthur Treacher's boasted a massive 826 locations across the United States. The restaurant chain would sadly not survive the next few decades due to a mix of several changes in management and the rise in prices in cod in the 1980s. These days, there's only one standalone Arthur Treacher's restaurant left in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. Our next restaurant was a short-lived success that would meet a similar fate. 10 Big Boys.
At Big Boy, before a recipe is put on a menu, it has to get past the big guy.
Big Boy Restaurant Group was founded as Bob's Pantry in 1936 by Bob Wyan in Glendale, California. The restaurants went through a variety of name changes from Bob's, Bob's Drive-Ins, Bob's, and Home of the Big Boy Hamburger, before finally settling on Bob's Big Boy. It eventually grew into a local restaurant chain and continued to expand until it became a national success. One of the main secrets to the early success of Big Boy was not just the solid menu offerings that were served across locations, but the signature treats that were served at certain locations to appeal to those markets. On the other hand, popular treats like a hot fudge cake and strawberry pie continued to be popular nationwide, but weren't offered in certain locations. Sometimes certain locations would even serve the same item under a different name, anything to appeal to local markets. Big Boy had a solid menu that offered breakfast staples, burgers and sandwiches, salads, dinner combinations, and various desserts. After 3 decades of expansion, Marriott Corporation bought Big Boy in 1967. This began to spell the beginning of the end for the restaurant chain as sales began to decline and the brand began to struggle with competition from bigger brands. In 1987, Elias Brothers would take Big Boys off the hands of Marriott in 1987 and continued to run it until the company went bankrupt in 2000. After another chain of acquisitions in later years, the company lost most of its locations and dissociated from all its franchisees. While Big Boys continues to operate a few locations across the U.S., the restaurant chain is a shadow of what it used to be. For our next restaurant, we'll be taking a look at Tex-Mex classics. 11 Casa Bonita. Casa Bonita was more than just a restaurant chain. It was a pop culture icon, especially in its hometown, Colorado. The chain was first opened in 1974 as part of a chain of Mexican restaurants that started in Oklahoma City. Bill Waugh first founded the first Casa Bonita restaurant in Oklahoma City in 1968. By the mid-70s, the chain expanded to locations in other states in the American Southwest. The restaurant was most iconic for its all-you-can-eat beef or chicken plates and sopa pillas with every meal. In 1982, Casa Bonita's parent company was sold to Unigate, and that was the beginning of the end for Casa Bonita. After a steady decline in sales due to an inability to compete with other local restaurant chains, Unigate sold Casa Bonita's restaurants in 1992 to CKE Restaurants. In 1997, the two remaining Casa Bonita restaurants in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Lakewood, Colorado, were converted into Star Buffet locations. After a string of openings and closings, Casa Bonita closed for good in 2011, leaving the Lakewood location as the last Casa Bonita location. In recognition of the restaurant, the Lakewood Historical Society chose to designate the restaurant as a city landmark on March 2015. We'll be moving over to the East Coast for our next bygone restaurant, 12 Chicken George. Chicken George was a fast food restaurant chain based in Baltimore, Maryland. The company's name was chosen based upon a character name in the book Roots, The Saga of an American Family, a book its founder, Theodore Holmes, was fond of. The first restaurant was opened in November 1979 in the Mondawmin Mall in Baltimore, Maryland. The company started small, expanding to a total of 6 restaurants in Baltimore, later branching out to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Washington, with a few franchise restaurants in Atlanta and LA, among others. The chain was most popular in Baltimore particularly, with many describing it as having become a household name overnight. By August 1980, the Baltimore Chicken George achieved the impressive status of the highest-grossing single chicken outlet in the country, and it was all thanks to the menu. Theodore Holmes put a lot of care into the menu, spending over $750,000 developing the company's chicken offerings. The result of this was some of the best chicken products available on the market at the time. Regular offerings on the menu included chicken, chicken salad, gumbo, fish and chips, and various side dishes. To appeal to even more people, the company opted to not serve pork products and instead used beef to flavor its products. After years of being a successful brand, George Hill and Sons Management bought the rights to the company in January 1987. This was the beginning of the end for the brand. In January 1989, the company was bought by Meldon S. Hollis Jr., and in September 91, Chicken George filed to dissolve the business in bankruptcy proceedings. Thankfully, our next restaurant didn't meet such an abrupt end. 13 Bill Knapp's. Like some of the most iconic restaurant chains of the time, Bill Knapp's was an American family restaurant chain. The first restaurant was founded by Clinton B. Knapp in Battle Creek, Michigan in 1948. The chain never gained nationwide success, but it kept a stronghold in Michigan, Ohio, Florida, Illinois, and Indiana, where it had locations. Bill Knapp's focused on serving the types of meal you'd eat with your family at home, but for people who were on the go. The restaurant chain's menu was mostly filled with offerings like a limited breakfast, sandwiches, and items like baskets, luncheon, and dinner plates. They also had a children's menu and a menu for animal food. They also made the recipes for a lot of their most popular meals available for people who wanted to try them out. Bill Knapp's was also pretty popular for its birthday and anniversary discounts. Diners visiting Bill Knapp's on their birthdays would get a percentage off of their bill based on their age. People celebrating their wedding anniversaries were treated to a whole chocolate cake to take home. And in some restaurants, people celebrating their birthdays would get a cake to take home in addition to their discount. Bill Knapp was very particular about the quality and freshness of the food, and preferred that the food was prepared from scratch, so locations replenished their inventory on a daily basis. At its peak, Bill Knapp's had over 60 locations across multiple states in the United States. Things started to go downhill after Bill Knapp's was sold off in 1998, and the new management decided to put in place a "that was then, this is wow" marketing campaign and a total overhaul of the chain's image. The marketing campaign not only changed the interior and exterior decor, but the menu as well. This alienated the core demographics of Bill Knapp's customers, senior citizens, and failing to attract younger customers, which led to a sharp decline in sales. To cut costs, the new owners of the chain opted to get their food from food services local to each restaurant. A change was necessary due to a listeria outbreak in the early 1990s that tanked the company's reputation, but this change affected the quality of food being served. This alienated the core demographics of Bill Knapp's customers, senior citizens, and failing to attract younger customers, which led to a sharp decline in sales. By 2001, Bill Knapp's tried to change course by announcing that the tradition is back, but by then it was too late. On May the 22nd, 2002, Bill Knapp filed for bankruptcy protection, and by the end of the year, the chain's last restaurant had closed. On to our next ill-fated fast food giant. 14 Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers Franchise Company was a chain of fast food restaurants that mostly had a regional hold in the Mid-Atlantic and northeastern United States. The chain was founded as the rebranding of the Roby's House of Beef chain of Fort Wayne, Indiana, after the restaurant chain was bought by the Marriott Corporation in 1968. After Roy Rogers, an aggressive nationwide franchising campaign was launched. It proved to be incredibly successful, and at its peak, the chain boasted well over 600 locations. The Roy Rogers menu offered essential fast food staples at its core, consisting of hamburgers, roast beef sandwiches, fried chicken, 9 side items, and a variety of beverages. It kept a standard of enjoyable, quality dishes at all its chains, and this reputation helped keep the customers coming. Then came 1990, and Marriott sold the Roy Rogers chain to Imasco, Hardee's parent company, in 1990 for $360 million. The Roy Rogers restaurants left at this point were converted into Hardee's restaurants, although they continued to offer Roy Rogers fried chicken afterwards. Loyal customers weren't happy with this conversion, and the units were returned back to the Roy Rogers brand. The restaurants tried to promote some new menu offerings, but they weren't successful, and Roy Rogers continued on its decline. After a chain of more unsuccessful acquisitions, the company continued to shrink. Today, the restaurant chain is a shadow of its former self, with just 35 locations in a few cities across the U.S. Our next restaurant chain wouldn't even be that lucky. 15 Little Tavern. Little Tavern Shops was a chain of hamburger restaurants that mostly operated in the southeast of the U.S. The restaurant chain was founded all the way back in 1927 in Louisville, Kentucky by Harry F. Duncan. The restaurant chain would expand steadily over the coming years, with the first Washington location opening in October 1928 and the first in Baltimore in June of 1930. From 1928 to 1931, Little Taverns had a block construction and a castle design that closely resembled the White Castles and the White Towers of the same era. By 1937, the restaurant chain already boasted 33 locations. The early days saw it offering a simple menu of hamburgers and other fast food options. The stores back then were pretty small and could only take a few customers at a time, so most business was takeout. This was perfectly represented by its slogan, "Buy 'em by the bag," and its signs promising "Cold drinks * good coffee." At the height of the chain mid-century, It had 50 locations across the Baltimore, Maryland, Arlington, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and surrounding areas. Dunkin' eventually sold off the chain in 1981. This was before the financial troubles and decline in sales the chain would face in the 1990s as a result of competition and an inability to adapt to modern trends in its menu. The last Little Tavern's restaurant closed on April the 29th, 2008. Our next restaurant was a big thing in the Midwest back in its heyday. 16 Hot 'n Now. Hot 'n Now was founded in Michigan in 1984 by William Van Domelen. Van Domelen had previously opened the first Michigan Wendy's restaurants and was a franchisee of Burger Chef in Southwest Michigan. The chain grew incredibly rapidly, and by 1990, Hot 'n Now had over 150 locations across the United States. The key to its success was its quality menu and simple business model, although the 39-cent price for hamburgers, fries, and soda would have definitely helped. That same year, PepsiCo bought out the growing fast food chain and placed its operations under its Taco Bell unit. This led Hot 'n Now's founder, Van Domelen, to resign from the company. PepsiCo immediately started to make several changes that didn't sit well with franchisees, starting with the menu in 1992. First, the president of Hot 'n Now, Don Pierce, left in 1993. Then the support to franchisees gradually started to drop. Hot 'n Now became little more than a test brand in the hands of PepsiCo, and by early 1995, the company closed 80 of its stores to sell the properties to franchisees. It was only a matter of time before Hot 'n Now filed for bankruptcy in 2004 and then sold to the Sten Corporation. As of 2024, Hot 'n Now operates only a single location in Michigan. 17 Mighty Casey's. Mighty Casey's was a fast food restaurant that first opened in 1980 in Atlanta, Georgia. From day one, Mighty Casey's stood out from the competition by offering higher quality menu options and exclusive recipes and ingredients such as Wisconsin beef, signature sauces, and hand-battered onion rings. Mighty Casey's was a major hit, especially in the Atlanta metropolitan area for its quality fast food, generous serving sizes, and creative menu offerings. The menu had a wide variety of offerings, a few of which included chopped barbecue sandwich, Cajun wings, hot dogs in basically every combo under the sun, orange shake, and breakfast menu. All of that would come to an abrupt end when Mighty Casey's was bought out by Crystal in 1994, and most of the restaurants were converted into Crystals. The next restaurant on the list was a major hit, as short-lived as it was. 18 Needix. Needix was a chain of fast food restaurants that was first founded in New York City in 1913. The chain was named after the last names of its founders, Robert T. Neely and Orville A. Dickinson, who founded the chain within a hotel storefront of the Bartholdi Hotel at 23rd Street and Broadway in Manhattan. At first, Needix was just a store that made and sold their signature drink, but by the 40s and 50s, the company decided to expand its menu and then its locations. At the end of the decade, Needix had outlets in New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Apart from its food offerings, Needix was also iconic for the white decor of its locations and its memorable slogans. Good food is never expensive at Needix, and always a pleasure. Come the 1970s, and Needix would find itself struggling to compete with the larger restaurant chains like McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts that expanded into its former strongholds. This set the once booming restaurant chain into a downward spiral that would be sealed in stone in 1981 after the brand faced backlash for the quality of food it offered at Central Park Zoo. Shortly after this, the brand ceased operations. There was an attempt to revive the brand in 2003, but sadly even that would fold up just a few years later. 19 Pancho's Mexican Buffet. Pancho's Mexican Buffet was a chain of Tex-Mex restaurants that first opened in El Paso, Texas in 1958. The restaurant was founded by Jesse Arambide Jr., a seasoned restaurateur who learned how to make Mexican dishes from his mother. The experience he got from cooking in large quantities while serving on an American naval troop ship during the World War II would inspire him to open a buffet-style restaurant. Arambide operated that single restaurant for multiple years before deciding to expand his business into a restaurant chain. The restaurant chain was owned and largely managed by Pancho's Mexican Buffet, Inc., which was previously named Pamex Foods, Inc. By 1988, there were over 55 Pancho's Mexican Buffet restaurants across the American South. Growth would start to slow after this, and by the end of 2000, there were still 48 restaurants in the fast food chain. The main draw of Pancho's was IT all-you-can-eat buffet, one of many in its extensive buffet offerings. Pancho's also offered the regular Tex-Mex fare like tacos, flautas, enchiladas, tamales, rice, refried beans, and guacamole, among others. After struggling for years and experiencing a few restaurant closures, Pancho's corporate shut down operations. All corporate-owned restaurants were closed, phone lines were disconnected, and the website was removed. The reasons behind it are unknown. On to the last restaurant of the video. 20 Henry's Hamburgers. Henry's Hamburgers was a restaurant chain that was opened by the Bressler's Ice Cream Company in 1954 as their way to break into the fast food market. Under the Henry's Hamburger name, countless franchises were established. The name of the chai was chosen to honor the memory of the late Henry Bressler, one of the brothers who had founded the ice cream company. In its early days, Henry's Hamburgers modeled itself after McDonald's, and for a while that was enough. By 1956, Henry's Hamburgers had 35 locations in the Chicago area, more locations than even McDonald's. By the 60s, there were more than 200 Henry's restaurants operating across the U.S. The burger chain was most popular for its advertising slogans, "Aren't you hungry for a Henry's?" and "Head for Henry's," and the burgers it sold for as low as 15 cents. By the mid-70s, Henry's Hamburgers locations would start to close as sales suffered in the midst of a string of mergers and changes in management. Nowadays, the once massive is left with just one location in Benton Harbor, Michigan. And that's it for the video. Which restaurant do you think we should have talked about? Feel free to tell us in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next video.